Thank you very much. It's a good day for me today. I've been very lucky to be here, of course. I found 20 pence on the floor, which is good, because that means I'm 20 pence richer than I was this morning. And over lunch, I got a wonderful email from Nigeria, which tells me that I've inherited millions of pounds. And once I've sent them my bank details, you won't see me for dust. Okay, so what I want to do today is to give you an insight into hybrid wheat. I'll put it the other way. It's the quest for the holy grail of wheat breeding. If you look globally, people have been trying to develop hybrid wheat for very many years. And what I want to do is to give you an insight into what's been happening in the last few years and why we could consider that this may be achievable now. Hang on, haven't we been here before? And yes, if you look down there, you can't see it, but it's 1996. That was an HGCA review about hybrid wheat in 1996. So it's nothing new. If you want a good read, it's worth doing. But life has changed and we've learned a few lessons over that period of time. We've learned not what to do. This is all about life in general. You have to make a lot of mistakes before you can progress. And so I want to just share with you some of those lessons that we've learned. So first of all, what is hybrid wheat? Well, wheat is a self-pollinating crop. That's why it's green, and it does not out-pollinate much. Okay? But what hybrid wheat does is it captures the value of combining two sets of genetics through cross-pollination. And we all know that hybrid vigor is well established in many commercial crops, such as maize, or as the Americans call it, corn, barley, and oilseed rape. So we know that there is hybrid value to be gained. And I think if you look at the yields with the barley, you'll see that the hybrid barleys are exceptional in terms of their consistency of performance. And they just are the highest yielding varieties, and that's true of hybrid wheat as well. So what's changed in the last 20 years? Well, we've seen discussions today about wheat yield has slowed as breeders have used a lot of, let's be honest, the low-hanging fruit. As John Bingham, who was my former boss at the PPI, said, the dwarfing genes were a nice quick fix. And those fixes don't come around very often. So we've used a lot of the traits, the yield traits already. On-farm yields we've seen have slowed as a result of shorter rotations, low grain prices. And in my view, that inhibits investment in wheat growing. If there isn't the money there, why should farmers invest? And I think there's been a lack of investment for quite reasonable reasons. And then we've seen these environmental pressures build, of course, and they've increased in priority. And we've seen earlier today that effective fungicides are increasing pressure. And I just put that the pipeline is challenging, as was already been cited this afternoon. However, there's been a resurgence, or not a resurgence, there's been a birth of new technologies that are available to the breeding community to enhance selection efficiency. Bill Clark earlier on talked about the opportunity that we have using wide crossing to develop new genetic material. And the speaker after me will talk about some of the technologies that are now routine, often in animal breeding, that can be translated into plant breeding. So just a very brief history of hybrid wheat breeding. The first serious attempts to produce commercial hybrids were in 1951. In 1959, nuclear male sterility, but there was no commercial eye to it. But it was in the 1970s that all of a sudden there was a big rush into chemical hybridizing agents. And at that time, there were big companies like Shell. Nickerson was actually at one time owned by Shell, the oil company. And I remember all the tractors had to have their oil changed in order that they had Shell oil in them. But there was a number of companies that developed chemical hybridizing agents. And you can see the list there. Of all of those, there's no doubt about it, A48011 was the most effective. And they all died for one reason or another, which I won't go into now. But interestingly, Croisnois is still registered for use in France and the Czech Republic. So there are hybrids being developed in Europe. So that's a short history. So where did it all go wrong before? Well, very simply, every hybrid activity in the UK has failed because of the cost of seed production and the lack of seed purity. It's nothing to do with yield. The variety's always been the most consistent, highest yielding varieties. The problem comes when you ask a farmer to pay twice the price of normal seed. It's this very simple equation. And however, those two issues are intrinsically linked, and I'll explain a little bit why. And to do that, we need to look at flowering biology. The most important thing that your wheat crop will do is flower, and yet it's actually not really discussed very much. But actually, it is the key to hybrid seed production. If we could put seed into a bag at the same price as conventional seed, the world would be hybrid, without a shadow of a doubt. So, what we've got to do is unravel what man's been doing for the last few thousand years. We've been selecting it to pollinate itself, and now we have to change this crop to being an out-pollinator. We've got to suddenly change the whole thing. But fortunately, there are a few varieties, very few, that have this attribute. In the world of wheat breeding, a good male is a rare event. So when the first hybrids were made, this was not taken into account as breeders rushed across anything with everything just in the hope of exploring the crop's potential. So we've learned now that we shouldn't be doing that. So the first thing to say is there's no shortage of pollen. For every fertilization event, there are approximately 9,000 pollen grains available. So that's because there's 3 anthers for every stigma, 3 anthers at 3,000 pollen grains each. So what can we do? Unfortunately, the problem is that wheat pollen is also very heavy and it's not easy to transfer by wind. And wheat pollen has a very short life, just 2 minutes under dry conditions. So early models were developed whereby strips of males and females were used to produce seed. I remember bags going out at Rothwell with pink bags and blue bags, and farmers were expected to grow strips of the blue, strips of the pink, and the females were sprayed with a chemical hybridizing agent, and we expected the pollen to move about 6 meters. The reality is that pollen moves about 2 centimeters. So the system was doomed to failure because of the poor dynamics of wind transfer, very simply. So what can we do? Well, the first thing is you can develop good male populations which extrude their anthers. And that's a key part of what I'm doing at the moment, is to develop good hybrid male lines. We cannot just have 1 or 2, we have to have hundreds of them. And secondly, we can look within related species. Bill Clark mentioned earlier on the wide crossing that can take place. So we can look for larger anthers. We can look for varieties that have got higher pollen grain numbers per year, per anther. And actually, we can also look for pollen that's got longer life, that instead of being 2 minutes, there's some examples cited of pollen that's viable for 24 hours. And we also need to select different flowering patterns, longer duration of flowering, or perhaps rapid flowering. We don't know, but there will be, wherever you look in wheat, there is variation for a number of these traits. And then we can use new technology, which we never had access to before, to identify flowering traits, and use these to fast-track material for optimal flowering types and floral biology. Okay, so that's the males sorted, so what do we do about the females? Well, the differences in female receptivity have been found, and then we can optimize those. We can get better females. Better females, not only in terms of combining ability, but also in terms of their receptivity, in terms of pollen attractiveness. And again, we can use molecular markers to transfer this rapidly. And nowadays, with plant breeding, you can move much more quickly than you did before. You can use new technologies such as single seed descent or double haploids to really fast track all of this. The other thing is we can consider using other dwarfing genes. At the moment, the varieties that you grow carry one dwarfing gene primarily. Some have got a different one, but mainly the UK was based on a single dwarfing gene. And lots of dwarfing genes were excluded from being used because they had a dramatic effect on the phenotype. Now, what you can do is that you can use genes heterozygously. So you can take a very short plant, cross it with a very tall one, and you'll end up with a plant which is about the same height as the one that you've got currently. So there's a lot of genetic variation we're not tapping into. And then we have to develop a seed production system that depends on a mixed male-female production. We know that happens in hybrid barley, we know it happens in rye, so there's no reason why we shouldn't convert wheat to doing that. And what we have to do quite simply is convert that. You can see the poor seed set on that. You can see florets are not fertilized, some are, some not, to that. Simple task, really. Once you do that, you've cracked hybrid wheat. It's as simple as that. That's the worst case scenario. That's the risk element if you don't get it right. And you can see there the saprophytic fungi have come in. There's no photosynthase. The photosynthase's got nowhere to go. And so if you get a black crop, it means that your wheat crop hasn't flowered very well. It may be nothing to do with the fungicide. It just means that you've messed up the flowering biology. But that's another thing. But that's the worst case scenario. And just as another aside, if you see ergot in your crop, it's usually a reflection of poor flowering biology as well. In the old hybrid days, we used to get more we could get more ergot off a hybrid seed production plot than wheat at times. So let's be frank about where the UK sits. The UK is not the highest priority. If you look down, you will see that the yield gap between what they're getting at the moment, the average, and the potential for Mexico, for instance, is a 50% yield gap in there. In Punjab, in India, 45%. But if you come down to the UK, it's only 25%. So we're really very close to our yield potential. So that's why the investment in hybrid wheat is going into these other countries, as well as here. But that's where that's where we're going to get the biggest benefits from hybrid wheat. And those benefits include consistency of yield. They are much more consistent than in conventional varieties. And now we look at second wheats, light land, take all situations. But they produce good physical grain characteristics, good bushel weights, and I put in there fusarium resistance. It's known that good flowering biology gives fusarium resistance. Now, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing if we could mitigate some of the problems of fusarium? And then they're bigger, more robust plants, so that gives us the potential opportunity to compete in a blackgrass situation. So if we look at the hybrid yield performance as such, hybrid wheat has to solve a problem on the farm. It is not a panacea for higher yield in every situation. When the first hybrids came out, the seed was expensive, so what did growers do? They put it on their best land. But actually, they don't have a problem with their best land, and that's not the place where we put it. That's another lesson that we learn. And secondly, the UK is actually the least favourable country in the world for producing hybrid, for looking at hybrid yield advantage, because despite the fact that we complained about it, we actually have a relatively benign climate, and we actually have very high yield potential. So initial expectations, of course, were original for high yield, were based on crossing strange varieties together and getting high levels of heterosis, often based on small plots, and often plots not treated with fungicides. So it wasn't really the real world. So I've got this quote up here. This is Norman Morley. Norman Morley was a farmer in Suffolk who was an icon for me. And this is something that he said to me one day. I don't want the highest yielding variety this year. I want one that will be in the top 3 every year. And isn't that really what we want? We want consistency of performance. Now, this is a little thing. I hope it works. This is not from me, but it's fun. And on the left-hand side, you'll see how conventional varieties go up and down. And if you look at the hybrids, look at that fun. Look at that. And the hybrids, you'll see, go up and down. Not as done as they should do. But basically, what you've got is that if you look at the area under the curve, in bad years, they do very well, and in good years, they do less well, but they will still do well. And it's the area under that curve which is important, the consistency of performance and the net production of grain over that 5-year period. We have to look at a long-term basis for yield, not just a one-off look. So that's where hybrids score best. And if you look at the recommended list, it gives an interesting insight into year, and you'll see there barley is a prime example of consistency over years. In the wheat, you'll see some varieties do well one year and not quite so well the following year. They may end up with a similar yield rating, but actually what we really want is consistency, and that's where hybrids will do that. They tend to be taller, they have more biomass, they have good flowering characteristics. They've got about 6 to 8% more biomass. If you then make a harvest index of 50%, you're looking at a yield increase of 3, 4 or even 5% in yield, grains yield, over where we are at the moment. And this is the interesting thing, they finish. Current varieties in beds die. They actually give up and die. Whereas hybrids don't. They keep going and going and going. And if you ever look at hybrids in yield trials, go and look at them a week or 10 days before the combine goes to them. Then you'll see what they do. They just finish in the ear. And that's why you get better specific weights and better consistency of performance. If you look at second wheats, they've got better rooting, higher biomass, and that biomass gives you those more resilient yields. There's an example that we took a few years ago. These are conventional varieties, but you see on the left-hand side, this is in a so-called uniform field. Left-hand side full of whiteheads, on the right-hand side not. We know that variation exists in conventional varieties, but in hybrids you could imagine the one on the right being every year consistent. And all those patches, which I'm sure you're familiar with, they won't disappear, but they'll certainly get a lot smaller. So where does this leave hybrids in the terms of potential market? I could see hybrids being in 20 to 25% of the UK wheat area. There's still 75% that will be conventional wheat. So what else have we learned? There are no market outlets that cannot be covered by hybrid wheat. If you want a bread making one, you can have a feed one, you can have a distilling one, you can have a biscuit one. There's no market sector that you can't be in. The other interesting thing is that hybrids fare better than conventional wheats in untreated trials, even with the same level of disease susceptibility. I'd like to explain to you why, but I haven't a clue. But they are very consistent in that position. So they're a little bit of a get-out-of-jail card. So is this just a ruse by the seed companies to make growers buy seed? Well, the only thing I would say is that farmers are not stupid. They're wise enough to know whether an investment, in this case in seed, is appropriate. And I'll give you one example. I've been working in Argentina for a number of years now. If you look in Argentina, that's a self-pollinating crop, but 98% of that is Roundup Ready. But it's because they can see the financial benefits. Yes, the seed is expensive, but nevertheless they see a financial benefit, and therefore they're happy to grow that. And that's exactly the same. When they double-stacked herbicides, the farmers backed off a little bit. They didn't buy it, and all of a sudden the price of seed went down. So there is a market demand, and will define the price, and seed companies will recognise that. And finally, you're looking at large companies now really understand that the era of the golden days of chemistry are changing. We are looking to see more genetics and chemistry coming together. That's been a common thread. And that the seed will continue, will need to make up a considerable part of it. So what else will change? The continuing story of a greater technical approach to growing crops will continue. We are not, in my view, growing seed or buying seed. We're buying bags of genes. This is what we have to do. We have to recognise that many of the other technologies have changed, but seed is still a little bit in the doldrums. So we need that continuing evolution of technical approach for growing will continue. Hybrid seed rates will be lower than for conventional wheats. And I think we should look looking at high-speed precision drilling. I put it here. I'm not sure whether this will show up. Probably won't. But if you can see there, though that is precision drilling, they're all drilled. It's a little army of soldiers out there. I'm not suggesting that a hybrid wheat will look quite like that, but I think that the technology is there for high-throughput precision drilling, and that would be a key part of growing hybrid wheat, I believe. So to conclude, this is the continuing story of it sounds like Star Trek, doesn't it? This is the continuing story of the development of hybrid wheat. I'm a bit of a Trekkie. So breeders have learned a lot over the last 30 years. New technologies that will be available, and that will come up in the next presentation. And that will increase the efficiency of selection for hybrid wheat. And the fact that major businesses such as Dow, DuPont, Bayer and Syngenta are investing is actually good news. It's nothing to be fearful of. The reality is that plant breeding needs an investment. It needs that type of investment. If we go back, I'm sure some of you had bacon and eggs this morning. The Teflon that you used in your saucepan came out of the space age, the space race. What we're going to see is, I think, a ripple effect from these big companies, from the pharmaceutical side, in order that we can then make much bigger progress, much more. So it's nothing to be afraid of. I think it's something to be embraced. And we do know that the current farming environment is difficult and demands radical solutions. This may be perceived to be a radical solution, and is a different solution to those that are currently available. So wheat demand continues to rise, and population projections point to 9 billion by 2050. So the reality is we just can't afford to fail this time. Okay.